Hi, my name is Nichole Schulte. I am the Associate Winemaker of Barrel 42 and Quoddy North Winery, which is based in Medford, Oregon. I'm here today to talk about impacts of wildfires on grape growing and winemaking in Oregon specifically. Recent wildfires throughout Oregon, California, and other wine-growing regions as far as Australia have caused great frustration amongst wine growers and winemakers. Specifically in Oregon, the 2013, 2015, 2017, and 2018 vintages have been particularly challenging because of the proximity of wildfires to vineyards during the growing seasons. These wildfires are generally started by lightning strikes in the dense Oregon forests. Smoke from these fires spreads into the scenic valleys, into vineyards, and in some cases impacts the quality of fruit and the wine made from that fruit. Fortunately, researchers and winemakers have developed and are currently continuing to further refine methodologies to mitigate the impacts of wildfires on finished wines. Today I'm giving a brief summary of the current understanding of grape growing and winemaking in wildfire-impacted vintages. What do we mean by smoke? Smoke is produced by the degradation of lignin, which is a phenolic polymer that cross-links with carbohydrate polymers such as cellulose to provide rigidity and strength to wood. Fire degrades lignin, cleaving a molecule at a particular bind into various compounds, including guaiacol, 4-methylguaiacol, syringol, creosol, and many others. These compounds are known to create off flavors and aromas in finished wines. At certain threshold levels in finished wines, they could be considered serious wine flaws. The process by which smoke integrates into grapevines and berries is not entirely understood, but the current theory is that smoke-derived volatile phenols can be absorbed both directly via the berry cuticle and via the leaves, as well as translocated to the fruit. Some of the smoke-related compounds then become bound to sugars in the berries. These bound compounds, known as glycosides, are odorless and flavorless, but glycosides can be broken down into their volatile forms, which are the forms that we smell and taste, by many means, including acid hydrolysis, oxygen exposure, time, increasing temperature, enzymes, and consumption. Consumption is especially notable because enzymatic activity in your saliva breaks down glycosides. The extent to which a particular individual has these enzymes present in his or her own saliva varies greatly from one person to another. So some people can be more sensitive to detecting smoke-related compounds in wines than others. So what can a wine grower do to protect himself from the impacts of smoke on a vineyard? The good news is that smoke in one vintage will not impact vintages in the future. Also, crop insurance is available that could partially cover a smoke-damaged crop. The bad news is that smoke is a risk during the entire growing season and that smoke cannot be washed off the vines or the fruit. A few quick notes on crop insurance. Insurance covers the crop intended to be harvested only, not the vines themselves. Crop insurance covers naturally occurring perils, which includes smoke from wildfires. A grower can insure 50% to 85% of the grower's average crop. The insurer will require documentation of that particular vineyard's average crop. Notably, a grower must file a claim within 72 hours of knowledge of potential damage to the crop. This is a relatively small window to file a claim. Also critical to note that the crop must be tested for exposure to smoke-related compounds before the crop is harvested. It is becoming increasingly common for growers and buyers to anticipate issues caused by wildfires in grape purchase agreements. A few points on this topic I'd like to stress. First, the current testing services available only report the levels of guaiacol and 4-methylguaiacol. Guaiacol and 4-methylguaiacol are merely markers for exposure to smoke and are not good predictors of the sensory perception of smoke in a finished wine. This is because the winemakers have many tools available to them to mitigate the levels of smoke-related compounds in finished wines. More on this in a moment. Next, both sides of a grape purchase contract may want to allow for flexibility in farming practices. For example, if a particular block is being farmed for a particular crop level for a red wine program, but the conditions during the growing season indicate that there is a danger of smoke, or perhaps the red wine grapes could be redirected into a rosé program, the grower and the buyer could renegotiate terms for that particular fruit. A contract may also allow for a shifting scale. This means that if pre-harvest testing results show specific levels of smoke-related compounds, different processes or terms may kick in the contract. Also, consider specifying in the contract who pays for testing. It may be fair, for example, to require the buyer to pay for testing if the test results show little or no smoke damage to the crop, but perhaps the grower should bear or share the cost of testing if the test indicates some level of smoke-related compounds in the fruit. In any event, flexibility in the grape purchase agreements on these terms and conditions will ultimately benefit both growers and buyers. When it comes to testing services, we have two main options. ETS and Enartis Vinquery are the two services providers that we have to choose from. Here's a side-by-side comparison of the two labs. They are more different than alike, so it's important for a grower and a buyer to agree on which lab to use for pre-harvest testing. ETS's lab is located in St. Helena, California. ETS will test a grape juice or wine sample and report the levels of free or unbound guaiacol and 4-methylguaiacol. The free or unbound compounds are only those not bound to a sugar molecule, which means those are the compounds that we can smell and taste. ETS reports the results in micrograms per kilogram, otherwise known as parts per billion, by weight. ETS's report threshold is 1 part per billion. ETS provides results in 2 days after receiving the sample, although this can be longer during peak processing periods. In contrast, Vinquery's lab is located in Windsor, California. Vinquery's testing services are slightly more expensive because Vinquery not only analyzes the free levels of guaiacol and 4-methylguaiacol, but also the bound levels of these compounds. Remember, the bound or glycoside forms of smoke-related compounds cannot be smelled or tasted. However, those bound forms do become unbound and volatilized for a number of reasons, which we discussed earlier. This is why a particular wine may seem fine on one occasion, but will develop off flavors and aromas at a later time. Vinquery's method for determining the bound forms of smoke-related compounds is proprietary and is not agreed upon by ETS. Also, because of the way Vinquery's equipment is calibrated, Vinquery's report threshold is at 5 parts per billion compared to ETS's report threshold of 1 part per billion. The report turnaround time for Vinquery is about the same as ETS, but is also subject to delays during peak processing times. For an additional fee, Vinquery will submit your sample to the Australian Wine Research Institute lab in Australia, which can provide a much more detailed report. While ETS and Vinquery only report levels of guaiacol and 4-methylguaiacol, the AWRI lab includes a handful of more smoke-related compounds, including syringol and creosol. However, this service is expensive. It's about $500 as of this recording, and the threshold sensible detection levels of these additional compounds is not widely understood or agreed upon. Because of the differences in these lab services, it is not advisable to compare the results of one lab to another. If you intend to engage in testing services during the growing season or during the winemaking cycle, pick one of the other to be your lab. Feel free to call them to discuss your reports. Both of these labs are industry partners and are great resources for us. They're here to help. Since these lab services tend to be expensive, take the time to ensure that your sample is adequately prepared. Send whole berry samples for grapes destined to be red wine. Select 300 random berries from the vineyard block in question and place them intact, undamaged, into a well-labeled sandwich bag. You can freeze the bag overnight to ensure the quality of the fruit does not degrade in the shipping process. Pack the sample in a box, preferably with an ice pack. If the berries break down during the shipping process, the test results can be inaccurate. Send juice samples for white and rosé wines. Send the juice cold with an ice pack so that fermentation does not start during shipping. I recommend using overnight shipping services from Oregon to California, which is more expensive, but it will ensure that the sample arrives in the lab in good condition. This will lead to more accurate test results. In a few days after the lab receives your sample, you will receive a lab report. The results of this report are merely objective measurements, but will not predict the wine's quality or flavor, which are both subjective measurements. Consequently, these lab reports are merely a tool that growers and winemakers have to work with, but are not the whole story. As a reference, the sensory threshold for guaiacol is generally accepted to be at 20 parts per billion, and the sensory threshold for 4-methylguaiacol is generally accepted to be 30 parts per billion. However, there are some disagreements within these levels. Some individuals are more sensitive to these compounds and may pick them up at substantially lower levels. Some individuals may not detect them until around 75 parts per billion. Again, these numbers are just a tool and not meant to judge a wine's flavor or quality. As winemaker and innovator Clark Smith said in a recent Wine Business Monthly article, "Taint necessarily taint." In fact, winemakers spend a lot of money to intentionally part guaiacol into wine with the use of toasted oak barrels. In low levels, smoke-related compounds can add complexity and interest to wine. Oregon wines have been well received in wildfire vintages. A search of Wine Enthusiast, Wine Spectator, and Wine Advocate indicate there are dozens of highly regarded Oregon wines in wildfire-impacted vintages. So let's change the conversation. Let's stop using the word taint, which suggests that there's a line in the sand, and on one side a wine is flawed and on the other side it's not. We don't talk about taint from Brettanomyces or volatile acidity in wines, which in low levels are desirable in some wines, but in high levels are quite displeasing. We will do ourselves a favor if we eliminate the word taint from the conversation. At its worst, smoke can lead to flavors of aromas in finished wine, including ash, smoke, cigar, roasted meat, and medicinal characteristics. For red wine grapes, the risks are greatest for Pinot Noir, Grenache Noir, and Cabernet Franc, especially in Southern Oregon. However, consideration should be given to any earlier ripening varietals where fresh smoke exposure occurred during and after veraison. We have less concern for varietals which have naturally high levels of smoke-related precursors, such as Syrah, which can have anywhere from 20 to 40 parts per billion of guaiacol, even in a non-smoky year. Also, Merlot can have naturally high levels of guaiacol, even during a non-smoky year. If you are a winemaker and you are concerned that red wine grapes may be smoke impacted, here are a few things that you can do in the winery to mitigate the potential problems. First, whenever possible, hand harvest your fruit to avoid damage to the clusters. Exclude all leaf material, which may contain smoke-related compounds. Consider blending options, especially if non-smoke exposed fruit can be blended with the smoke exposed fruit. Consider developing a new blend or sourcing fruit from a non-exposed area. You may also consider declassifying a wine. For example, if you have a vineyard designate or a reserve tier wine, you may need to declassify that or lower that tier in a smoky vintage. If you follow an organic or a biodynamic winemaking process, you may need to consider going outside of those parameters during a smoky vintage, because some of those programs are very restrictive and do not allow certain tools and additives that may help you in your winemaking process. One winemaking theory that has shown success is to build up a complex, layered, and interesting wine around your smoke-exposed fruit. Smoke-related compounds are extracted early during the fermentation process and maceration process, so limiting maceration or fermentation time may not be enough to reduce your smoke compounds. Stick with your normal cold soak period. If that's something that you follow, stick with your normal fermentation length that you would generally follow, and fermentation temperature. Use untoasted oak during fermentation to reduce intensity of smokiness and increase the complexity of the wine. However, I recommend avoiding toasted oak products during fermentation, as the fruit was already exposed to toast in the vineyard. Also, recommend avoiding maceration enzymes, which can release smoke compounds from the skins and pulp into the wine. There are hundreds of types of commercial yeast strains out there available for you, and too many to detail here, but consider a yeast strain that maximizes fruit characteristics. This will play up the fruitiness of the wine and downplay any smoke-related characteristics. You want to avoid strains that exacerbate those smoke characteristics. For example, D254 and BDX, two very popular strains, may not be the best to use in smoky vintages. Also, avoid yeast strains that may cleave smoke precursors or have higher amounts of pectinase enzymes that break down skin cell walls. One of these yeasts, for example, is called VL3. Check with the manufacturer of your particular yeast strain for more details. Pressing parameters can have a huge impact on the finished wine. To minimize the risk of smoky characteristics and red wine must, press gently. Separate your press fractions. The harder you press, the more smoke compounds you'll extract. Expect lower yields because you're pressing more gently. Settle the wine well and discard the solids. You'll want to avoid extended lees contact or extended contacts with the solids because the smoke-related compounds can hang out in those solids. If you like the lees contact effect in making wine, and many of us do, use lees from another lot that didn't have smoke-exposed fruit. Cooperage selection also plays an important role in mitigating the effects of smoke-impacted wine. Like I said before, we want to build a well-rounded complex wine, and this can be accomplished with the correct barrel program. Medium and medium plus toast barrels can build complexity, which is a little bit counterintuitive because we're adding smoke to smoke. But what we're doing is adding layers of complexity to work with the smoke instead of let the smoke characteristics come to the front of the wine. We'll want to choose barrels that accentuate and frame the fruit notes and add a perception of sweetness. A little bit of sweet oak or sweet vanillin can work wonders to mitigate the off flavors that you get from smoke. However, you will want to avoid heavy toast barrels because that can exacerbate the smoky qualities of the wine. Neutral oak may also allow some of those smoke characteristics to come forward because there's not a lot in the neutral oak to react with the wine. So that was some basics about red wine making. Now let's talk a little bit about white and rosé winemaking. Also, for these programs, you'll want to hand harvest. You'll want to avoid leaf material because some of those smoke-related compounds can hang out in the leaves. And you'll want to overfilling bins in the field so that the fruit arrives at the winery in the best condition possible. Again, pressing considerations play a very important role here. You'll want to whole cluster press your white and rosé clusters. Destemming them and soaking them for color can pull out some of those smoke-related compounds. You'll want to also press gently. You'll want to separate your press fractions just like you do for red wine making and expect lower yields. You'll want to avoid skin contact at any length you can because those smoke-related compounds will hang out in the skins and in the pulp that's closest to the skins. You'll want to avoid maceration enzymes that help pull out and cleave those smoke-related compounds. Also, clarifying your juice prior to fermentation can work wonders to remove any of the smoke-related compounds that are undesirable. You can also ferment on activated carbon, which is known to attach to volatile phenols, including smoke. Here's an example of rosé juice fermented on various levels of carbon. This is a rosé of Pinot Noir from a smoke-impacted vineyard that was made as a trial wine. The glass on the left is the juice without any additives. The glass in the middle has 25 grams per hectoliter of activated carbon added, and the final glass has 50 grams per liter of activated carbon added. As you can see, this looks very displeasing and very unappetizing, but the idea here is that the carbon is attaching to those volatile phenols during fermentation. Eventually that carbon will fall out to the bottom and you're left with a clean rosé wine. There are other types of remediations that are available out there. However, I have to caution that anytime you fine or remove something from a wine, you risk removing the desirable characteristics along with the undesirable characteristics. Yeast-based products can correct some sensory imperfections in the presence of volatile phenols. Also the activated carbon we just talked about, and another product that is based on ketazan, which can target astringency and bitterness, two off flavors known to be associated with smoke-related compounds. There are two major service providers that are both located in California that have claimed to have technology that can deal with wines that have smoke flavors. So at the end of the day, if you've done everything you can to make a wine that doesn't have smoky characteristics, but you're not happy with the result, you may consider using one of these service providers. Wine Secrets in California uses molecular reverse osmosis for targeted removal of smoke-related compounds. Cone Tech is another provider in California who claims to have a proprietary method that can remove both the bound forms of smoke and the unbound forms of smoke from your wine. I personally have not used either of these services, but I have worked with these service providers before. They are very professional and nice to work with, and I encourage you to contact them if you have a wine that you think would benefit from these processes. Additional information can be directed to me, Nichole@quadynorth.com, and I'd also like to give some credit for some sources that I consulted during this presentation. UC Davis's Department of Viticulture and Enology, Clark Smith's Postmodern Winemaking Resources, the Labs of Vinquery and ETS, and the Australian Wine Research Institute. I'd like to give a brief overview of a recent trial that I did with some smoke-exposed Tempranillo. Had Tempranillo come from a vineyard very near the Taylor Creek fire, and decided to take a chance and make wine out of it, even though it could have been borderline. And the results came out very well, because we were able to put some oak on this red wine that was helpful. And a summary of the trial is here. At first, I took the free run and pressed fractions of this Tempranillo, and I put it in an unoaked vessel. I took the free run and put it in a neutral oak vessel. I took the free run from the press and I added it to a new French oak Mercury special toast barrel. I took the press fractions and added it to a neutral oak, and then I took the press fractions and added some of it to a new Allery medium plus barrel. And surprisingly, what we found is that the more oak that was added to the Tempranillo, the less smoky the Tempranillo tasted. So again, this is counterintuitive, thinking that you're adding smoke to smoke and that would exacerbate the problem. But to the contrary, the barrel toasting actually adds layers of complexity and flavors that help make a well-rounded, bigger wine. Thank you for watching my presentation today. Once again, my name is Nichole Schulte, and I'm one of the winemakers of Quoddy North Winery in Barrel 42. Barrel 42 provides custom crush winemaking services for over a dozen wineries located throughout Oregon and beyond Oregon. We invite you to stop by Quoddy North's tasting room in Jacksonville for a sampling of the Rhone varietals and Cabernet Franc that Quoddy North is known for. Thank you very much.
Bis jetzt.